Greetings. Today we're going to be talking about the important ideas of argument forms and validity. Now, an argument form is a basic kind of pattern of reasoning, and we will see that by identifying certain kinds of argument forms or patterns of reasoning that we can make some progress on the idea of validity. Also, maybe we can escape having to appeal to miracles when we're constructing our arguments. To get things started, it will be helpful to have a definition of validity handy. We've looked at more than one definition, but this is the one that I think is most helpful most of the time. Here it is. A valid argument is one in which it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false at the same time. Let's take a look at this with an example. This is an example that I hope you will agree is valid. Socrates is a human being. All human beings are mortal. That is, all human beings are sure to die. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. I hope you agree that that's a valid argument. It's actually been used by philosophers for nearly 2,400 years to illustrate the idea of validity. But what do we mean by saying that it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false at the same time? In this case, we can illustrate it with a kind of a graphic illustration. We'll see further examples of this sort of thing later, but let's just try it here. Suppose you have a little blue circle to represent Socrates. So you've got Socrates, this is the first premise, and you want to illustrate or diagram that first premise. You want to say that Socrates is a human being. So you put him inside another circle that represents all human beings. So Socrates is a human being. He's included in the group of human beings. Okay, now you've got something to represent all human beings. But the second premise says that all human beings are mortal. In other words, this group that includes all human beings has to be inside of the group of things that are mortal, beings that will die. And so, let's try to represent that. We put an orange circle to represent mortal beings. All human beings are mortal beings. Now notice what we've done here. We have diagrammed both of the premises. We've got something to represent that Socrates is a human being. We've got something to represent that all human beings are mortal. But in the process of just drawing out this diagram, we've also got Socrates, the little blue circle, inside the big orange circle of mortal beings. But that's the conclusion. In stating the premises, you've already got the conclusion there. If you do something that represents all the right logical relations between them, there's no way that Socrates could be a human being and all human beings be mortal and Socrates not be mortal. When you draw out the relationships in the right way, you see that you're already given that Socrates is mortal when you're given those premises. So it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false at the same time. Now we're going to go further from this and take a look at the idea of a form of argument. Now we're going to introduce a number of important terms. We've already looked at argument forms, if you'll forgive the pun, a little bit informally. But now we want to be a little clearer, a little more explicit, a little more systematic. An argument form is basically a pattern of reasoning, and it might be something like this. If A, then B, A, therefore B, where the A and the B represent statements. That's a form of argument. It's a basic pattern of reasoning. You can see this pattern of reasoning over and over again, repeatedly. Now, just like this, you can't do much with it. However, we're going to put this together with a few other ideas, and we'll get to some tools that we can actually do something with in assessing or examining the validity of arguments. By the way, does that argument form there appear valid to you? It should, because it is. Now that we have sort of a bare bones notion of argument forms, we can turn to talking about substitution instances. An argument form might look something like this. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. Now the basic structure of that is it's just a bunch of if-then statements. But the A, the B, and the C all stand for statements themselves, component statements. And you can substitute into this form these component statements. For example, you might have an argument that goes like this. If George is a mouse, then George is small. If George is small, then George doesn't eat much. Therefore, if George is a mouse, then George doesn't eat much. That happens, of course, to be a valid argument. In addition, not only is that a valid argument, but any set of statements that you could substitute in would also be a valid argument, provided that you substituted in consistently. Let A and B and C and any other letters you use in a sequence like that be used consistently for the same statement every time. And everything that can be substituted in would be a substitution instance of that argument form. And that gives us a little piece on something further. When you have something like this, you have a valid argument form. What it means to have a valid argument form is to have an argument form such that every substitution instance, anything you could substitute in there, would itself be a valid argument. That gives us a way of going a little bit in the direction of generality. Instead of looking at just a particular argument, we see why the argument is valid. It's an example of, or a substitution instance of, a valid argument form. And when you have the valid argument form, everything that could be filled in there is a valid argument. Now we need a couple more pieces and we'll begin to be able to put these ideas to work. One piece is conditional statements. You've probably noticed that we use a lot of if-then statements. If this is true, then that must be true in logic. And I want to point out certain things. We've used them so often that we've got specific names for different parts of a conditional statement. These are also sometimes called, just to abbreviate, conditionals. Take a look at this one. If it is snowing, then the mail will be late. That's a conditional statement. Now notice that a conditional statement includes inside it two other statements. One of them is called the antecedent in the brackets there. It is snowing. That's a statement. The other one, the part that comes after the then, is the mail will be late. That's called the consequent. Now, it's important to notice that the antecedent doesn't include the if, and the consequent doesn't include the then. That's sort of like the framework, but the picture is these two statements. The antecedent, it is snowing. The consequent, the mail will be late. Any kind of conditional statement has an antecedent and a consequent. And by paying attention to that, you can figure out a little bit about how would you like to symbolize that. For example, if you were trying to look at an argument form, you might want to say if S, and use S for it is snowing, then M, and use M for the mail will be late. One of the things, though, that makes that a little bit more difficult is the fact that there are various what we can call stylistic variants. If-then statements are very common, not just in logic, but also in everyday language. And understandably, people don't want to say just the same words over and over again. So people have used or have developed different ways of making or saying these if-then statements so that they're not just some rigid format every time. Here's another example. If it is raining, then the ground is wet. There's a variety of different ways that we could represent that, or different ways that we can say it in English that make no difference to the meaning. However, it's worth taking a look at them, just so you get used to the idea. Here's one. Given that it is raining, the ground is wet. Assuming that it is raining, the ground is wet. The ground is wet if it is raining. The ground is wet given that it is raining. The ground is wet assuming that it is raining. It's raining only if the ground is wet. Now you might come across any one of these in an argument that you were trying to figure out what the basic form was. And by having this idea of stylistic variance in them, you would look at that very quickly and you'd say, oh, I'm looking at, say, number 6 here. You wouldn't say, I'm looking at number 6. I'm saying that. But you're looking at, it is raining only if the ground is wet. And you see, that sounds like one of those conditional statements. I wonder what the antecedent of that is. Could it be if, and we've got if in front of the ground is wet. So if the ground is wet? No. If the ground is wet, then it's raining? No, that's not what it says. It really is a version of saying it is raining. That's the antecedent. And then the ground is wet is the consequent. But you might take a little while to notice that or pick that out. But knowing about these stylistic variants will help you in looking at arguments that you are going to come across. Real arguments, not just arguments that are carefully constructed to be easy to handle. Now, we're ready to look at some famous valid forms. As you remember, a valid form of argument is one where all of its substitution instances are valid. We're going to look at 5 valid forms. We call them famous valid forms because they're very widely known and they're very common. They're widely used. I'm going to start with just giving you some names, and then we'll look at them with the help of some examples of each form. There's modus ponens, modus tollens. Those are probably a little bit obscure to you unless you're used to speaking Latin. There's the hypothetical syllogism, the disjunctive syllogism, and last, the constructive dilemma. Those are probably also a little bit obscure to you, unless you're in the habit of talking to logicians. Now let's go on and talk about modus ponens. Here's one. If we save enough money, we can take a vacation in the Bahamas. We've saved enough money, so we can take a vacation in the Bahamas. That's an example of modus ponens. It's an example that has this basic form, which we have seen before. It goes like this. If A, then B. A, therefore B. We use A to represent we save enough money. We use B to represent we can take a vacation in the Bahamas. And this is a valid form, which means that this argument and every argument that has this form is valid. Let's go on to the second one, to modus tollens. Comes from the Latin, which means something like the taking way. That's probably still a bit obscure. But here's an example. Canada does not directly control the governments of countries other than itself. If Canada is a neo-colonial power, Canada directly controls the governments of countries other than itself. Hence, Canada is not a neo-colonial power. Now let's see, how would we represent that? It would be something like this. If A, then B. Not B. So, not A. The if A, then B, it doesn't matter what order you put these in, is the second premise in our argument here. If Canada is a neo-colonial power, Canada directly controls the governments of countries other than itself. Where Canada is a neo-colonial power is symbolized by A, and Canada directly controls the governments of countries other than itself is symbolized by B. And then we say not B. That is, we're denying B. We're saying that B is not true. And that corresponds to the first premise here. Canada does not directly control the governments of countries other than itself. And then the conclusion is, so therefore, not A. Hence, Canada is not a neo-colonial power. This is another valid form. Whenever you've got a case that it says, if A, then B, but B turns out not to be true, or is not true, then you have to also conclude that A is not true. Let's go on. We can look at a hypothetical syllogism. This is where you chain two of these conditional statements together to get a third conditional statement. Here's an example. If Sam makes it through Shelob's lair, then Frodo will be saved. If Frodo is saved, then Gollum will lose his precious ring. So, if Sam makes it through Shelob's lair, then Gollum will lose his precious ring. Now this is a little bit different. As I said, here you're chaining together a group of these conditional statements, and your conclusion is another conditional statement. It looks like this when you symbolize it. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. You put two conditionals together, and you get a third one, which you didn't have at the beginning. That's a hypothetical syllogism. Once again, every substitution instance of that form is a valid argument. Now, let's take a look at disjunctive syllogisms. This comes from a word that logicians use for something that includes an or, either this or that. There's water or milk in my glass. I guess that should be two statements. Either there's water in my glass or there's milk in my glass. That's a disjunction. Let's take a look at an argument with a disjunctive syllogism. Either we should launch a preemptive strike, or else we should adopt a policy of containment. We should not launch a preemptive strike. Therefore, we should adopt a policy of containment. Now the first premise here is either is A or B. We should do one or the other. We should not launch a preemptive strike. That's not A. And so the conclusion is, so B. That is, we should adopt a policy of containment. Now this is one form of a disjunctive syllogism. A or B, not A, so B. But it can go the other way too. A perfectly good disjunctive syllogism would be A or B, not B. Therefore, A. This is another of the famous valid argument forms. Now, let's try putting them together. And that is, let's look at an argument in which we use both conditional statements and disjunctions together. This kind of argument form is called a constructive dilemma. Let's take a look at an example. Teresa is either going to buy the Greg Bear novel or the Orson Scott Card novel. If Teresa buys the Greg Bear novel, she'll have Mr. Bear autograph it on Monday. If Teresa buys the Orson Scott Card novel, she'll have Mr. Card autograph it on Tuesday. So, she'll either have Mr. Bear autograph his novel on Monday, or she'll have Mr. Card autograph his novel on Tuesday. Now, let's take a look at that and try to symbolize it, to isolate the underlying form. It's either A or B. She's going to buy the Greg Bear novel or the Orson Scott Card novel. If A, then C. If she buys the Greg Bear novel, she will have Mr. Bear autograph it. If B, then D. If she buys the Orson Scott Card novel, she will have Mr. Card autograph it. Therefore, either C or D. That is, she'll either have Mr. Bear autograph it or Mr. Card autograph it. This is called a constructive dilemma. This is another of the famous valid forms. Now that we've got several of these forms, we can begin talking about what to do with them. All of these forms, all five that we have discussed, are valid argument forms. And what that means is that every argument, every substitution instance of one of these forms is valid. And this begins to give us a method for assessing or judging the validity of arguments. We can do it like this. You've got an argument in front of you. We can identify the component statements in the argument and uniformly label each one with a capital letter. We identify these component statements. We're looking at it. We identify the component statements and label it so that we've got things simplified. We rewrite it using capital letters and we eliminate the stylistic variance. Instead of saying it's raining only if the ground is wet, say if it's raining, then the ground is wet. And then represent that even more simply, if A, then B. And then Once you've got an argument stripped down to its essentials, the A's and B's and C's and so forth, then check to see whether the pattern of reasoning is taken from our list of valid forms. If it is, the argument is valid. That's all there is to it. Apply these 5 basic forms and you've got a way of identifying a large number of valid arguments. Before we close today, I'd like to say something about some limits of this famous valid forms method. It doesn't identify all valid patterns of reasoning. As was explained in your textbook, there are many other possible patterns of reasoning that are valid but don't appear on the list of famous valid forms. Nonetheless, these are very useful. These 5 patterns that we have looked at today appear over and over. And so, knowing about these gives us a good start on identifying valid arguments. A second kind of limitation on this famous valid forms method is this. It does nothing to identify invalid arguments. Since there are other kinds of valid arguments than those that are listed in the famous valid forms, well, if you come across an argument that doesn't match one of the valid forms, well, it might either be an invalid argument or it might be one of the other valid arguments. Still, the method of famous valid forms gives us a lot of help. Many arguments do conform to one or more of these famous valid forms, and it gives us a way of identifying and recognizing that they're valid. And because these are forms, basic patterns of reasoning that you can see over and over again, when you've got a valid form, every substitution instance of that form is also a valid argument. Now, my telling you about these, describing them to you, going through examples with you, well, that's the beginning. Likewise for the textbook. What you need to do for this really to sink in is something that I've been saying all along. You have to practice, practice, practice. I'll hope to see you soon on Blackboard, and hope to see you soon here to discuss these issues and these techniques further.